As I think we're all pretty well aware, the Kraken will be sellers at the deadline. The question is just how many players move and which players those are. What's cracking, everybody, and welcome back for a quick look and discussion on what to expect at this year's quick approaching NHL trade deadline. And because it is coming up here in just the next few days, I'm not going to spend too much time on this since we are likely to start getting some concrete answers here before too much longer, but I saw a lot of questions about it and honestly planned to try and get this out a little bit sooner, but with illnesses and kids, it was a little bit harder to do. Still, we got a few days time and the Kraken haven't made any new trades yet since the Borgen trade way back in December. So let's take a look at who could be on the way out and who is certainly on the way out. Now, some good news for the Kraken right out of the gate is that, to me anyway, this does look to be a seller's market at this year's trade deadline, with a lot of teams still at least close enough to the playoffs to talk themselves into being able to make a run and at least not be sellers at the deadline, and with still plenty of teams that know they're going to make the playoffs willing to buy. So for the Kraken, regardless of how many players or which ones they ultimately decide on trading out, they should be able to get a pretty good return, especially with the track record that Ron Francis has in trades, which has been pretty good. Which, with that being the case, and really only one, maybe two teams in a better position than the Kraken to really sell at the deadline, that does mean that there's a decent chance the Kraken move a number of players out here in the next few days. But before we get there, let's real quick run through the list of guys that are certainly to almost certainly not going to be moving at the deadline. There is a very short list to me that you can 100% lock in. They absolutely will not move. Bet your life savings on it. I mean, don't actually bet your life savings on it, but you get my point. There's no way the Kraken move them. That would be Matty Beniers, Joey Gourde, and with how he's been playing recently, Shane Wright has earned his way into this category. Now, there's still plenty of other players that I would be very surprised if the Kraken end up moving for a variety of reasons, like Vince Dunn, Riker Evans, Capo Caco, and it sounds like apparently Adam Larson, based on some reporting from Elliot Friedman, who said there have been calls about Adam Larson, but the Kraken have told teams, specifically the Toronto Maple Leafs, to not call them asking about Adam Larson. So those guys seem like the Kraken still see them as a core part of their future going forward and have no interest in moving them. And then you got guys like Chandler Stevenson, Ty Cartier, Mahura, some of the other depth guys that just aren't going to get any interest from teams, so there's no way that they end up moving. And a couple guys like Montour and Eberle, who maybe there's a mix of the two. The Kraken see them as a part of the future, and I don't really see any teams asking about them either. And I suppose to fully round things out, though I don't think this will come as a shock to anyone either, the newly called back up Philip Grubauer would definitely fit into the category of players that there will not be interest on, so they will be with the Kraken through the end of the season. I mean, for Grubauer, that kind of depends on whether or not he goes back to the AHL, but yeah, they're not going to be traded at the deadline. So that then still leaves a decent chunk of players, over a third of the roster, that I could see a fair chance that they end up moving at the deadline. But there is now just the one player that I think is an absolute lock to move. Again, guaranteed he will be moving at the deadline. He'll play his last game here with the Kraken on Tuesday, if not second to last, with maybe one or two games left before the deadline hits. That being Brandon Tanev. Now, obviously, Tanev, this isn't going to be good news for everybody. He has been a fan favorite pretty much since he got here. But with him being on an expiring contract and the reporting that there's not interest on either side of extending that contract into the future, Tanev will play his last game or two here with the Kraken in the next few days. Yeah, to just wait to see what the Kraken get back for him at the deadline. And we'll spend a little bit more time on what Tanev's time here in Seattle has looked like when that trade inevitably does happen. But that is the one guy that I would be very surprised if he is still on the Kraken roster come the end of the deadline. As for what the Kraken can get back for Tanev, I wouldn't expect anything incredible. Most likely a third, maybe a second if they do retain a decent chunk of his remaining salary, which it sounds like they're willing to do. There's really no reason not to. It is an expiring deal again, so whatever they retain will be off the books on the offseason, and it's not like they're using that cap space the rest of this season for anything, so it makes perfect sense for the Kraken to retain and try to get a little bit more back. With Ron Francis's track record, after all, he did get a second-round pick for Jeremy Lauzon a few years ago, so it's not out of the question that he could get a second for Tanev. A third, though, is probably more likely in my eyes. But moving on for now, and again, we'll do a little bit more of a deeper dive on any trades once they do happen, and we can have a little bit more meaningful discussion of what the Kraken got in return and whether it was a good trade for them or not. But with Tanev the only lock to get traded and nobody in the category of very likely, at least in my eyes at this point anyway, there was one player in that category, but he's been moved out for reasons that we'll get to here in a second. That leaves the last category of players, which is we'll see, somewhere around 50-50. Some guys a little bit more likely than that, and some maybe a little bit less likely. But it's a decent chunk of players here that I wouldn't be surprised to see them move, and I wouldn't necessarily be all that surprised to see them stay. Now, that one player that earlier on in the season I even had as a lock to get traded, and was very likely for a while, but now with the recent reporting that there's actually some interest, at least from the Kraken, but seemingly mutual interest in getting him extended and keeping him for another couple of seasons, it sounds like Yanni Gourde might not be as likely to move at the deadline as we previously thought. Well, just kidding. Apparently Tanev is not the only player all but guaranteed out the door from the Kraken, as I had the majority of this recorded the day before, actually before the Kraken played against the Wild, so I had a whole thing on Yanni Gourde and him likely to come back. Then he played against the Wild, and then there was some reports that the Kraken might be interested in keeping him around for another year or two. But as it turns out, Gourde and Bjorkstrand look like they're headed to Tampa Bay in a trade that could bring back 2 first-round picks, plus Elliot Friedman saying that a key part of the deal on the Kraken side is 2 first rounds coming back. So if part of the deal is 2 first-rounders back for Gourde and Bjorkstrand, as much as it hurts and as much as those were the 2 players of the big group of players that was rumored to potentially be on the trading block, those were the 2 that at least my heart most wanted to stay with Seattle. I mean, 2 first-round picks, potentially 2 first-round picks plus is certainly more than I would have expected. So, I mean, good for the Kraken if it does end up happening. And at least for Gourde, he gets to go back to a place where he found a lot of success. His career started, and he got 2 rings. So, we'll cover it a little bit more once the trades actually happen and the trade deadline has come and gone, what the Kraken did at the deadline. But if that one does come through and it's 2 first-rounders plus, that's a fantastic deal for the Kraken, even if it does hurt. Now, with that having been said, if the Kraken could kindly refrain from doing any more trades while I finish getting this video out, that would be fantastic. And we can talk about the trades when they actually happen, and I don't have to worry about having parts of this video void by the time I get it posted. Well, we'll see. More likely than not, I'll be halfway through uploading it and somebody else will have gotten traded. Again, we'll go over everything after the deadline if that does end up happening. At this point, it seems like the next most likely player to get moved could be Jamie Oleksiak, who it sounds like there's a decent amount of interest in, and although he does have a pretty extensive no-trade clause, he could always waive it for a potential buyer, and even with 2 years left on his deal, well, the Kraken could use some more space on the defensive end to potentially pick someone up in free agency or bring up some prospects that could be ready here by next season. Even outside of who could replace Oleksiak in the Kraken roster next season, that $4.6 million cap hit that he has going into next year would not be a bad thing for the Kraken to recoup, especially with it looking like he's trending towards probably being a 3rd pair defenseman for the Kraken next season, especially if they do move up Riker Evans to be alongside Montour on a more long-term basis. So even though losing Oleksiak, I suppose like losing Tanev and Gourde, would mean losing another one of the original Kraken, not that that plays into the decision-making for the team or anything like that, but it's a guy that's been around for a long time and has become a big part of this team's identity, and it would also mean that a local bank has to shoot a few more commercials, but it is a trade that I think would make a lot of sense for the Kraken to do if they can get a respectable return. And obviously the interest is there in the first place for a team that Oleksiak is willing to go to if it is one that is on that list of teams that he has on his no trade. Now, as far as what to expect as a return in a possible Oleksiak trade, I don't think a second is out of the question, maybe a third, but defensemen do typically draw a little bit more interest. They typically get a little bit better of a return than forwards. There's fewer of them typically on the market, and especially for an established guy like Oleksiak, who on teams that are a little bit less deep defensively probably does fit a little bit more of that second pairing role, especially if it's like, say, the Canucks, for example, who really do not have a particularly deep defensive core. Even with the extra year on his contract, he is a guy that would still have to stick around for another season with whoever trades for him. It's not an expiring deal, which is typically a little bit more attractive for teams. They can just pick a guy up and then let him go to free agency. Yeah, I don't think a second is terribly unreasonable, especially considering, again, the Kraken did manage to get a second for Jeremy Lauzon in that inaugural season, which I still don't know how they managed to pull that one off. A couple other names we've seen thrown around in trade rumors involving the Kraken would be Andrei Burakovsky and Oliver Bjorkstrand. For different reasons, I think it's somewhere around 50-50 that either of them get traded. With Burakovsky, he's got 2 years left at 5.5, and considering how things have gone with the Kraken, largely derailed by the two big injuries that he had, I think if the Kraken can get someone to bite there, even with a little bit of retention on the rest of this year's salary, and who knows, maybe even they retain on some of what's left of those last 2 years, I think the Kraken do it. It just has not really worked out here in Seattle for the most part. He did look pretty good for them. He was their leading scorer leading into that injury in the first season here, but the last couple of years really just have not gone that well for Burakovsky. And with the Kraken, I think looking at making some space in their forward core for next season to make some additions in the offseason, potentially make some big swings in the offseason if they're there to make, with the cap going up and some salaries leaving in this trade deadline. I think there's a lot of reasons for the Kraken to move Burakovsky if the trade is there. Again, partial no trade, so it depends a little bit on who the potential trade partners are and whether or not Burakovsky is interested in going to a team if it is one of the teams on his no trade. A couple other names that we really haven't heard nearly as much about, if anything at all, but if the Kraken are really trying to shake things up in the offseason or going into next season, I could potentially see going on the move if the price was right, would be Jaden Schwartz and Eeli Tolvanen. Both have just 1 year left on their contract with the Kraken, so a team wouldn't necessarily have to be taking on that much more term. Neither contract is really that prohibitive, so a team could potentially take it and not be strapped for cap space necessarily. I mean, Schwartz is over $5 million per year, but also provides a fair amount playing on the first line for the Kraken. Not that that's where he'd be playing for another team, but still both are players that I could potentially see another team having interest in, enough to give the Kraken a deal that they maybe not can't refuse, but decide not to refuse. Still, with not having heard that much about either one, I don't know that the chances are better than 50-50. In fact, I'd say chances are better that they both end up staying in Seattle. I wouldn't necessarily be shocked, though, to see them move if that did end up happening. And finally, that then just leaves us with the one big one. At least, certainly, the player that should draw the biggest return if the Kraken were to move him, and a player that we have heard a fair amount of discussion and rumors around in Jared McCann. Now, me personally, I really hope the Kraken don't move McCann, especially with it being clear from ownership, at least what Todd Leiweke was saying, that this is a team that is still eyeing, especially this next season, but the next couple of seasons, of getting into that competitive window where they are a perennial playoff team and even making some deeper playoff runs as we get 2-3 years down the road. If that really is how they view themselves, moving Jared McCann just absolutely does not make any sense. Sure, he hasn't necessarily been scoring at nearly the rate that we've gotten used to over the first 3.5 years over the last couple of months, but some of that's had to do with just finding a good spot for him in the lineup, and I think especially with how Shane Wright's been playing lately, he might have found that spot and that might come along sooner rather than later. The other side of things, though, with that lack of recent points production in mind for McCann, if the Kraken were to sell on him right now, they'd be selling McCann at his lowest value point in his entire time with the Kraken. That having been said, with the contract he has and the points production he has had during his time on that contract, it's maybe the best contract the Kraken have on their books right now, aside from potentially Joey Daccord, depending on how you look at it. Either way, it's a contract they would have absolutely no trouble moving and probably getting a pretty good return for. I mean, personally, I'd be very disappointed with anything less than a first-round pick, maybe even a first-round plus for McCann, especially if you were to send him to a team that has a good chance of making it deep into the playoffs, at which point you'd be getting that first-round pick as a very late first-round pick. Yeah, I think you'd need to have first round plus for it to even be close to worth it for the Kraken. Still, if they really do see themselves, as ownership says, as a contender going into next season or wanting to be a perennial playoff team over the next few years and making some deep playoff runs, trading McCann right now just doesn't make any sense to me, and I really hope that they don't do it, especially with still 2 more years left on that contract. Which, the good news there is that it does sound like, per Elliot Friedman again, and that most recent report that we have via 32 Thoughts, that the Kraken might not be all that interested in trading McCann after all. They might still trade him if they were given an offer that they just absolutely cannot refuse, say a couple first-round picks plus something like that. But in general, it sounds like the Kraken are of the same mind that if they do want to be competitive in the next couple of years, McCann is the type of player that they need to keep on this roster. Now, granted, they could definitely do a better job of finding a spot for him on the roster that's a little bit more stable than what we've seen this season, where he's really bounced around quite a lot in the lineup. Not a ton of consistency in what line mates he's had, and maybe that has, especially over these last couple of months, contributed to that lack of point production. But now that he at least seems right now to have found a spot on the wing of right with how Wright's been playing, again, going forward, that could be a pretty good spot for him, and hopefully the Kraken start to see a little bit more of that points production come back that we saw through the first season, 3 seasons of him here in Seattle. So one more time then, just to recap, as for which players to expect to see move or could move here in the next few days, Tanev, expect to see him gone. He's playing his last couple games with the Kraken, if indeed he does play these next couple of games. Then Oleksiak, probably the next most likely. And then you've got the Burakovskys, Bjorkstrands, who we've heard some stuff about, and maybe a little bit more likely than 50-50 that they do move, at least with Bjorkstrand. Anyway, Burakovsky, I'm still a little bit curious what teams are showing interest and what they're asking the Kraken to do in order to move that contract, but maybe they're able to move Burakovsky. And then the Kraken really are trying to shake things up, move a bunch of guys out so that they can give some prospects a look the rest of this season, and then figure out what big swings they want to take in the offseason with all the cap space that they could get by trading some contracts that still have a year or two left on them back. Well, let's just say if they do want to position themselves to make a couple pretty big swings in the offseason, assuming that they're there, and be a little bit more competitive next season, then moving out some contracts like Oleksiak, Bjorkstrand, or even Schwartz-Tolvanen would allow them to do that. So anyway, all that to say, we do have a lot of questions at this point in time as to what the Kraken are going to do here in the next few days, what they see as the trajectory of this team going into the next few seasons, and what they want to set themselves up to do here in this next offseason. And either way, whether it's just the one trade of Tanev or a number of trades and a big shakeup here at the deadline, we'll have our answer here in the next couple of days. With that, though, as always, I'd love to know your thoughts down in the comment section below. What moves you expect the Kraken to make, hope the Kraken might make, and what return you think the Kraken might get if you disagree with anything I said in the video. I'd love to know your thoughts again, down in the comments below. And we'll all find out together here in what could be a whirlwind of a trade deadline for this franchise. Obviously, we'll have another video breaking down what the Kraken do at the deadline and what that means for the future once that happens. But until then, and until the next couple of R&Rs, stay safe out there, be good to each other, God bless, and go Kraken.